From crypto scams, Nigerian princes and YouTube bots, scams are everywhere. But some scams are far more sinister than others. In fact, the worst scams of all have become so big that they're now just a normal part of life. I'm talking about the sorts of scams that can't be detected by the common eye. The scams run by the most powerful people in the world. And so today, we're going to be exposing the biggest scams that have ever been pulled off. Starting with our first scam, the education system. It all began around 100 years ago in America. As the US was industrializing in the early 1900s, there was a massive problem occurring, that being a lack of workers. You see, there were enough people, but they just weren't suited enough for factory labor. They often lacked basic education, and they weren't used to sitting still for hours doing the same thing over and over again. Their natural lives of agriculture and relative freedom made them too hard to mold into worker drones. People weren't even used to the concept of a stranger being our boss. It was emasculating and strange. However, for people like John D. Rockefeller, the most powerful businessman in American history, and arguably one of the richest people in history.
Because I studied a lot about like Rockefeller, Carnegie, guys like that.
Yes.
And those guys, nobody's amassed the fortunes those guys had. Rockefeller had like 336 billion in today's dollars.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
This was a huge problem, because he'd built his insane fortune off the backs of millions of people working on assembly lines, and he needed more drones. You see, Rockefeller got in early on the oil business. Using money he made from selling supplies in the Civil War, Rockefeller made a series of investments into oil refineries. Long story short, these grew and grew, until he was the owner of the largest monopoly of all time, with 90% of the entire US market for the resource would be controlled by him. And then using his immense fortune and power from this monopoly, Rockefeller beat off any competition and strangled the rest of the business world. And even the government. Any protests or moves against him, he would cut off the oil supply. And what amounted to minor losses for Standard Oil could wipe out any other opponent off the map. So for decades, his Standard Oil monopoly was untouchable. But he didn't really stop there. All the oil he was drilling and refining was needed for industry, and the more industry there was, the higher the demand and price would be. And so that's where the labor problem came in. Rockefeller had the most to gain from industrialization. So like any other billionaire, he threw all of his money to exploit the population. With an initial investment equivalent to over $30 million today, Rockefeller founded the General Education Board, whose mission was to give rural American citizens a bare minimum in education. They opened hundreds of schools, trained thousands of teachers, and improved literacy rates across the country. They even rolled out a mass treatment program for hookworm, an incredibly common parasite at the time. And this just seemed great. John D. Rockefeller was revolutionizing America. He was cutting out parasites and educating the masses. However, despite these seemingly great benefits, Rockefeller wasn't a charity. I mean, just look at this quote from his organization's dream for rural Americans, and you'll get some idea of what his true intentions were. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning, or men of science. We shall not search for great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen. The task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one: to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are, making their intentions perfectly clear that they were never looking to create great thinkers and people capable of skepticism. America's ruling class only wanted docile sheep. So over time, Rockefeller and his sons would spend over $80 million making his sinister dream come true. The general method originated in the Prussian system of the mid-1800s, around 50 years before the rest of the West fully adopted it. You see, they figured out that a school to train factory workers should resemble a factory, or more specifically, a production line. On the surface, this means that the long and grueling hours would be the same, as well as the rigid structure. Being born into this system, people would slowly mold to authority. The school bell and its role in partitioning time into work periods was directly based on the factory whistle. But the most impactful decision was treating the children like products on a factory line as well. Each year of their lives, and ours as well, was partitioned into grades of study, with strict exams and requirements before the next stage. And this was the template that America and the rest of the world adopted, in large part thanks to the Rockefellers and their greed for more. Andrew Carnegie, another industrial tycoon, also got involved, as he set up a system for college professors to get given a pension using $10 million of his own money. Which sounds great, but there was a catch. This meant full-time 4-year courses, and an additional 4 years of full-time school was an entry requirement. And he did this by inventing a unit called a course credit. One course credit was equal to 120 hours of lessons and study, and the colleges that he gave money to were required to ask applicants for 14 of these course credits, equaling 4 full years. And these colleges needed his money. And to be fair, this was kind of a necessary change, as it guaranteed at least some level of equality across education. But it also gave Andrew Carnegie and his foundation immense power over the education system. Almost all of the colleges relied on him. This had the power to influence all other universities as well. And so with one check, Andrew Carnegie changed the entire system from the top down. But he wasn't finished with the education system. Carnegie saw industry and his fortune resting on 3 pillars: income, labor, and ability. He had an almost unlimited supply of wealth and workers. He just needed to get them educated enough to work in a factory. So whilst he funded hundreds and thousands in libraries and improved education for millions, it wasn't really all just for a noble cause. Like the Rockefellers, he wanted workers, not thinkers. He even tried to simplify language itself to reach this goal. In 1906, Carnegie spearheaded the creation of the Simplified Spelling Board. They pushed for the changing of over 300 words into simplified versions. Some of these changes include addressed to addressed, though to though, and surprise to surprise. The reception was lukewarm at best. Even though some of the changes made sense, people found it both funny and annoying that Carnegie thought he could just change the entire English language with a few donations. It only got worse when Carnegie convinced Teddy Roosevelt, the president at the time, to sign an executive order enshrining these new spellings just 1 month later. The people were merciless in their mockery, with one newspaper even running a headline, "Nothing escapes Mr. Roosevelt." Nearly all of the Simplified Spelling Board's changes were scrapped shortly after. But whilst this wildly out-of-touch project failed, the majority of Carnegie's wishes for the education system were carried out to the letter. But its most enduring change was the credit system, and it's the reason we lock kids into classrooms for 8 hours every single day. It doesn't matter if kids aren't actually benefiting from countless hours trapped in stuffy classrooms. The negative health effects of sitting in one place all day is enough to justify change, not even considering how much it stifles the natural development. Schools are almost a mini prison. But this kind of artificial pressure is particularly toxic to men, as is the vast majority of the current education system. Because instead of learning how to harness and control your natural aggression and testosterone, young boys are then shamed and forced to conform to a generally feminine environment. Any fighting, any creativity, any passion is punished harshly. Even self-defense isn't allowed. You're taught to flee to daddy instead of fighting back for yourself, making millions and millions of children just weaker generally. Not to mention that women make up 84% of primary teachers in the US and Western Europe. So lots of these boys at school never really have a male role model in their formative years, which is one of the key reasons why women do generally do better at school. Which is crazy because even with everything we've learned about children and their well-being, everything we've learned about mental health, everything we know about how the school system fails young children, the system is still exactly the same 100 years later. The people in power who could change it don't want to. They like the system because it keeps people within the rigid social order, stifling them of any opportunity for upward movement, while also demasculating young men, reducing their creative spirit and crushing it into the ground, making everyone weak, submissive droogs. And that's why the state will continue to underfund it and neglect it in your country, because it still does the job that it was intended for, creating docile workers. Not entrepreneurs, not thinkers, not philosophers, not dreamers. They want obedient workers. But there is still a problem here. Some children still don't fit into this mold. Their creativity is bursting out too much that you have to take other measures. And for that, we just need to turn to the next scammers on our list. But before we continue, I want to tell you about the sponsor of this video. Now, if you want to start a high-paying career in the technology industry, but you don't really have any previous experience or a degree, then Course Careers is here to help. They're replacing college as the modern way people are starting careers. And it's so simple. All you do is go through an affordable online course where you learn everything required to actually do the job. Then they help you land a position by partnering with companies who drop their degree and experience requirements to hire Course Career graduates into entry-level positions and internships. Check out some of their stories of people like Nyla, who went from being a 19-year-old Starbucks barista to making over $60,000 in a remote technology sales career. Or Ben, who went from a college dropout working as a middle school janitor to making $80,000 as a tech sales rep working fully remote. And then there's people like Kyle, who went from being a 37-year-old assembly line worker in Indiana, pressing buttons with no degree, to making over $150,000 in a medical technology sales career. So go to CourseCareers.com, link in bio, using my discount code MOON50, where you can sign up for the free introductory course where you'll learn exactly how you can start a high-paying technology career without any degree or experience required. Now, our next scam on the list is the pharmaceutical industry. You see, the pharmaceutical industry saw this problem at schools and wanted to fix this problem by getting kids hooked on Ritalin, Adderall, and other ADHD medications. Because by claiming that people not being able to sit in their chair properly was a sign of a mental illness, pharmaceutical companies could make bank, billions in profits. And that's why prescriptions have shot up over the past 2 decades, but particularly in the US, which is 5% of the world's population, but somehow over 80% of the world's ADHD prescriptions. And so what are these prescriptions doses that pharmaceutical industries are giving children. Well, we're talking about chemicals almost exactly the same as methamphetamine in structure. And whilst these pills may keep kids in their seats and docile, is it really worth the side effects? I mean, just the side effects on the box alone include possible insomnia, high blood pressure, and a faster heart rate. And this is just the immediate consequences. This doesn't even show the true extent of the long-term damage. I mean, right now the evidence is still murky because it's all relatively new, but ADHD medications have been linked to increased rates of cardiovascular disease and heart problems, which really isn't a surprise considering how similar it is to methamphetamine, especially how heavy this would be for a young child at school. And this brings up the question, why are these prescriptions necessary in the first place? Well, for children with less severe symptoms, hard psychoactive medication seems more like a tool to suppress their natural need to explore the world around them. Sitting in a classroom for hours and hours a day from the age of 5 is unnatural, unhealthy, and emasculating. It is completely out of tune with how children have developed for millions of years on Earth, and it's only getting so much worse in recent years. And you'll always hear this classic defense of the pharmaceutical industry, that the rise of these prescriptions is just because we're more aware of how prevalent ADHD is. But it's not about the diagnosis itself, it's about how we actually treat it. And pharmaceutical companies have gone crazy trying to addict children to their drugs. 69% of children from 6 to 11 with ADHD are now being prescribed medications, and this was before the pandemic. And then when the lockdowns happened, pharmaceutical companies got to work by incessantly lobbying the US government for permission to prescribe and dole out ADHD meds without even seeing the patients in person. And this isn't just ADHD medications. The pharmaceutical companies have got the whole of America addicted to their drugs, whether it be antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, opiates, or whatever else they can addict you to. And the worst part is that now they've got America addicted to these drugs, kids also have to pay ludicrous prices with every prescription, giving these companies ginormous profit margins. And with this money, they were happy to sink millions into the issue to make further returns, getting even doctors addicted to it now, with 1 in 18 US physicians receiving industry payments for prescribing stimulants and other ADHD medications. And then predictably, the government has just recently passed a law allowing so-called teleprescriptions, and the floodgates were open. Companies like Cerebral Inc. and Doane Global Inc. jumped on the trend, setting up incredibly lucrative online and by phone prescription services, fueling the rise from 35 million prescriptions in 2019 to over 41 by 2021, completely taking advantage of the pandemic to add billions to their valuations. I mean, Cerebral Inc., the company we mentioned earlier, quadrupled their valuation in 2021 to $4.8 billion, all while the world economy shriveled up into a ball. Where everyone else got poorer, pharmaceutical companies got richer. And it's not really hard to see why, when these prescriptions are just so easy to get. You can just have one 18-minute phone call and get the drugs the next day. Only recently have reports come in that they've actually had to fire their top executives after he brought up how they were overprescribing dangerous medications. And this is for children. Their former CEO alleged that Cerebral were aiming for 100% diagnosis to prescription rates, and to do this, they were engaging in predatory TikTok advertisements. One advert had an 18-year-old spokesperson telling children and young adults that normal things like laziness and feeling depressed were clear indicators that they might have ADHD. Another linked overeating with ADHD, selling the medication to people as a cure to being overweight, or also that they can give these methamphetamine pills to children. And by latching onto the self-diagnosis craze and people's insecurities, along with people faking mental illnesses on TikTok, they were able to make billions selling a dangerous and addictive product. In fact, Cerebral were even accused of installing illegal trackers onto their websites to gather personal data on their patients. Lawsuits relating to all of these scandals are still ongoing, but it's unlikely we'll ever see these drug dealers face the same kind of justice the common man could expect. It's hard to tell whether these companies have caused or are merely profiting off the self-diagnosis craze. I mean, it's a worrying sign that disabilities and medical conditions have been so co-opted as social clout. It's not that they shouldn't be talked about, but making a mental illness your whole identity has become way too common. So why is this happening? Well, by claiming you're mentally ill, it gives you an excuse to be a bad person, as you can blame every negative thing about yourself on just some mental illness above you. And so then if anyone criticizes you, even if it's yourself, you can just always blame it on your supposed condition. And then there's people who go further, faking an entire mental illness for clicks and money. Like Tix and Roses, the infamous TikToker who faked Tourette's for clout. Now, it was immediately obvious to anyone paying attention that she never really had Tourette's. Like when Tix and Roses would shout their tics as loud as possible at home.
Wow, 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 wow.
But in public, she always whispered them.
Look, she's got COVID.
I mean, only someone who's self-conscious and able to control it would be able to play it down in public like this. And sure, some people with Tourette's can suppress their tics for a time, but there were other signs as well, as Tourette's can be physically painful when tics stress parts of the body repeatedly. But Dickerson Roses never actually hurt herself or even made a large mess. Everything she pretended to do could easily be cleaned up and never actually hurt her. She would even hesitate sometimes before her tics, like in this clip where she stops what she's doing for a second so that she can act out her planned performance. Not to mention past live streams that caught her out, where she was able to read poetry for hours without a single tic.
One medium I really enjoy is painting. A lot of those skills that I learned as I began my journey in painting translate very well over to painting yarn.
Now obviously mental disorders aren't quirky or cute, they shouldn't be an identity, but people like Dickerson Roses and companies like Cerebral have been happy to profit off of them all the same. The whole story goes to show how far these people will go to take as much of your money as possible, however unethical their methods might be. And our next scam is another way that they do this, and it applies to nearly every industry or field that you can think of. Now you see, you might have noticed how stuff that you buy today just doesn't really last as long as it used to. Whether it's a new phone or a t-shirt, things just break more easily. And then for some products, when you try and repair it, you find out that the manufacturer has specifically made it hard or even impossible to do so. However, predictably, it's all just a massive business tactic. And as crazy as this sounds, they are inadvertently turning everyone into mass consumers through a process called planned obsolescence. Now this concept is often talked about in regards to the tech world, as one of the most famous cases was when Apple intentionally slowed down the processor speed on their old iPhones. In 2016, people all around the world started reporting battery issues in the iPhone 6 and 6S models. And this all happened at once. Now Apple wrote it off as just a manufacturing issue, but then a year later, it was shown that the issue only started when people updated their operating systems, as Apple had snuck in their limiter with certain iOS updates, deliberately degrading the battery and usability of the phone to try and prompt customers to buy a new one. However, Apple wasn't the first, and they didn't come up with the scam themselves. In fact, companies have been putting this off for years. In the light bulb industry, for example, planned obsolescence has been used for decades. They first met in the early 1920s, where representatives from the largest US and European manufacturers all agreed to start making a worse product, as they artificially shortened the lives on their bulbs from 2,500 hours to just 1,000, making everyone in the country buy around 2.5 times more than they needed to. And with just a little bit of collusion, these companies use planned obsolescence to more than double their potential revenue. And for 2 decades they have kept their lifespans artificially low. They even specifically employed engineers to design shorter lasting light bulbs and find companies which didn't shorten theirs. However, the downfall of the light bulb cartel was the organized structure, as it took a lot of work to keep the various companies in line, and it was already dissolving before World War II dealt with the final blow. However, it's their legacy which now lives on today, and the light bulb cartel proved that planned obsolescence works incredibly well, so it was co-opted by countries, organizations, industries, and governments around the world. But the problem goes so much deeper than just some cheap t-shirts. Planned obsolescence has seeped into everything. I mean, just look at the things we've been building over the past 50 years. We used to create beautiful structures that lasted centuries, works of art built with local materials, perfectly suited to their environment and time, meant for the people that would use them. Buildings would emanate beauty, it would uplift your soul. However, today, pretty much everything new is made out of steel, concrete, and maybe some glass, constructed purely to serve a privileged few. And you'll be lucky if they even last a half century before turning into a dilapidated eyesore. These glassy monuments to insipid vacuity have become the mainstay of all cities around the world. And it's not just the big important buildings. Cost-cutting and artificial lifespans have seeped into the roads we walk on and the places we live. I mean, Roman roads and infrastructure have lasted centuries after the Western Empire fell, but 2,000 years later and our roads crumble to dust in just a few years. Potholes are everywhere, and the worst part of planned obsolescence and its impact in society is the waste, as companies are happy to tear the planet apart to make something that only lasts 6 months before it's added to the billions upon billions of tons of waste, all while supposedly doing everything they can to help the environment, even though they're destroying it. The real reason for this mass consumerism though is to keep the economic machine going, but it's our next scam that shows how fragile and illusionary its foundations truly are. I mean, the 2008 crash was a perfect example of how artificial and worthless money has become, ever since we left the gold standard. Because in 2008, the banks started betting on housing markets and found massive profit, so massive that they started betting on their own bets. So by 2007, these banks were so exposed that all of their money and assets wouldn't be able to cover their losses if they did lose. And then they eventually did, and things were bad, causing a recession that would ruin the lives of untold millions around the world. But then why did the banks ever make such a stupid error? Well, greed is always the underlying motive, but the real truth behind this is that all these banks knew that they would get bailed out if it collapsed, and so the people at the top of these banks wouldn't really face any personal consequences. And predictably, they were right. Now, ostensibly to save the economy and people's lives, the government handed out $2.5 trillion back to the banks, also that they could solve the problem which they created. But it didn't stop 6 million Americans losing their jobs, Americans that would then pay tax to fund the banks that caused the economic crisis in the first place. However, the worst part of this is that they didn't even solve anything afterwards. Instead of ensuring the economy would stabilize, lots of the money went straight into the bonuses of the people who actually caused the crash. I mean, the top 5 Lehman Brothers executives got paid $2 billion for their crimes. These people weren't fined for causing the worst financial crash in modern history, they were in fact paid for it, all by the people who had their lives ruined by them. I mean, if anything, things are even worse now than they were back then, as the world's people have been hit with both the double punch of inflation and recession, all while your paycheck has stagnated and food and energy has gotten more and more expensive. However, the real truth is, we just never really recovered. The actual economy is far worse than the numbers in GDP show, and you can tell based on the never-ending inflation and the rise in personal loans, which have increased by 16% over 2022. And these aren't people buying boats. In fact, the majority of these loans are taken out to stave off starvation, just for a few more months. It's different for companies and banks though, who by taking advantage of rock bottom interest rates has allowed them to borrow trillions of dollars, and they have then used these risky loans to prop up growth in their tech companies or their investment banks, all whilst the real businesses that give people jobs suffered. And this has played havoc on the real economy, as inequality has risen dramatically and actual productivity has stagnated, and yet somehow the economy has grown massively, almost like the banks just started adding in trillions of dollars from thin air, and then COVID only made things so much worse.
Coronavirus, new coronavirus.
I mean, in 2021 alone, the US printed almost $1/2 of US dollars in a year. And whilst this extra money was able to help a lot of people in America for a short time, this cost the future of America. Because when world governments tried to raise interest rates and get everything back to normal, it just didn't work this time, unlike the 2008 crash. And so this is where we are now, violently adjusting to the sheer scale of invented money and debt-fueled growth. There's already been some casualties. Silicon Valley Bank was one of the first to fall. You see, tech companies were and probably still are the most overvalued in our economy, so it's understandable that the bank dealing in their massive loans would eventually go belly up. However, their recklessness didn't really help either, as they would actually fire their chief risk officer nearly a year before the collapse. But it's not just SVB, so many banks have recently been exposed, like Credit Suisse that recently just collapsed under the weight of his own scandals and greed. And now their crimes and scams are way too many to list. They range from shaky financials, fraud and money laundering, to predatory loans given to third world countries in exchange for control of entire industry within these countries. Not to mention the mysterious death of a private investigator, and the final nail in their coffin when their CEO was caught spying on outgoing executives and was forced to resign. And despite efforts from the Saudis to prop up one of their favourite money holes, the bank lost 75% of its value, and is now just being bought up by another bank. However, it becomes clear when you look into these collapses that the people at the top always benefit from it. In fact, the only people that the massively inflated money system benefits are the people who own these massive companies. Their values skyrocket as they charge more and more for the same thing, making a few people richer and everyone else poorer. And so by handing over control of the monetary system to these people, we've enabled possibly the largest scam in history. And the only people that the massively inflated money system benefits are the people who own the massive companies. Their values skyrocket as they charge more and more for the same thing, making a few people richer and everyone else poorer. And by handing over control of the monetary system to these people, we enabled possibly the largest scam in history. But then why are they doing this? Well, to keep the people subdued. These meaningless, crummy products are what society says you should strive for. This is what we supposedly value. And it makes sense because other than survival, they're the end goal of all the futile office jobs and middle management careers that make up the majority of people's lives. We don't value beauty or art, we value meaningless time wasting. And that's why the rat race is the next scam on our list. So by this point, you should understand that through school, big pharma, and all these other methods of toxic conditioning, you have become another rat in the rat race. And the rat race in itself is one of the most toxic scams that we'll talk about on this list. Now, you often hear this term, the rat race, being used to sell shady products or a multi-level marketing scheme. And there are of course a lot of jobs out there that give people a lot of purpose and contentment. However, the rat race that I'm talking about is the rat race shared by almost everyone in society. I'm talking about the rat race that gives you a life without freedom, where your time is sold for nothing, where you have just enough to survive the next day in the office, having as much coffee as humanly possible to fix widgets on Wonkles, slaving away like a human robot until the weekend. And another weekend in which you can burn whatever money you have left on drugs and alcohol. And you live like this because what you do provides no meaningful value. And because of this, you were never actually paid anything that gives you freedom. And without any freedom, you are then stuck. Always stuck with burdens, with debts, with loans, with mortgages. And because of this, you can never escape. You're always in debt to someone. And because you have no money, you're always forced to go back for that weekly paycheck. And it's in this moment that you become part of someone else's agenda, with your survival depending on someone above you, someone who sees you as just a statistic. Corporations that have amassed more power than countries, while you yourself have no power, where your subconscious outrage and despair of the world around you is buried under an avalanche of cultural drivel. Living in a pod in a soul-destroying, alienating, unaffordable, decadent, deteriorating city. However, on the surface of all of this, you're then told that this is actually normal. That waking up, driving to the office, doing nothing at work, hiding away in the bathroom to get away from the boss, and coming home completely drained, to a wife who never actually loves you, is somehow actually normal. It's normal to be this depressed. It's normal to be in debt. It's normal to never have any freedom. It's normal to hate your life. It's normal to have a lifestyle of not knowing your neighbors and community, a lifestyle of 5-lane traffic to work, a lifestyle of your partner cheating on you, a lifestyle of laziness and despair. Somehow this is promoted as normal, that it's good to have a job and live in the massive city, that you're actually a productive member of society, even though your soul knows this is all bullshit. Your life, tastes, passions have all been molded by a toxic education system, media, and corporations to be in their interests and not yours. And the only thing keeping you going in this rat race is the cheese, is the material wealth and objects. Because as you live in a society that prioritizes material wealth over everything else, this is all you live for. And the problem here isn't money, it isn't the objects themselves, but the expectations that are raised in the hearts and minds of millions of people, leading to your belief that possessions of certain things will actually bring you happiness, that finally getting the money to go on that big holiday will finally give you life satisfaction. If you get that nice car and finance, you'll finally be happy. Because our media, our influencers, our role models fuel this mentality, and the result is a society that fetishizes objects, placing them above the inner worth of you as an individual. And because of this, the individual in the rat race is then treated like a meaningless statistic. And this lack of inner worth lets you submit to people above you. It lets you be treated like shit. All while the objects that will give you happiness remain elusive, always never realizing that your imagination and inner wealth holds far more value than any material possession ever could. And the result of all of this is a society of atomized individuals, addicted to opioids and living in nihilistic hopelessness. And this lack of purpose that comes from the rat race isn't only personal, but is actually manifesting into civilizational malaise, leading to the self-destruction of our culture and society. And when you understand all of this, is it really any surprise that our current culture is just a sewer pipe of obscene tawdry hedonism? Well, when you realize that this is all to restrict your freedom, this next scam on our list makes a lot of sense. Things would be taken to a whole other level in 2020, with the biggest scam in this video, and that being the government's response to COVID-19. Now, it all began when governments and big tech worked hand in hand to silence anyone claiming COVID was from a lab, a fact that was later proven to be true, with governments now quietly admitting that the lab was the true origin and not the wet markets. However, this was only the start, because governments across the world would quickly put societies into lockdown, completely isolating everyone in the houses to stop the spread. And by doing this, the entire global economy was shut down, catalyzing the current recession that we're wallowing in. And within these lockdowns were more draconian measures. Now, this video could go on for hours if I was to mention every single thing, but one of the key measures was the enforcement of mask wearing, with governments claiming that wearing a little mask would help control the coronavirus, a fact that was also later proven to be false. But this didn't matter, because at the time government puppets like this advocated for industrial grade face masks for children. But this puppet in particular had a change of heart after her own son suffered cognitive impairments due to prolonged mask usage. And it was this revelation amongst many that exposed the alarming impact masks had on language development and social interactions in children, all while governments around the world made this mandatory, forcing all children, all adults, everyone anywhere to have to wear a mask, even though there was no health benefits to this, and it completely destroyed the population's development. And anyone at the time who mentioned these concerns would be met with ridicule and dismissal. However, studies now unequivocally show significant drops in children's IQs and language development, all caused by these mask mandates, which did absolutely nothing to stop the virus, but in turn actually destroyed the health of the population. lockdown. But all voices raising these questions were silenced. The media would adopt a more sanctimonious tone, consistently labeling people who wouldn't wear masks as granny killers and science deniers. And it was this hypocritical shift in narrative and this train of illogical thinking that allowed the population and governments to completely ignore all the evidence against mask efficiency, along with the harmful consequences they were inflicting on the population. And all the while, the lockdowns were destroying the livelihoods of millions and millions around the world, destroying not only the development of children, but causing huge spikes in mental health issues, physical health issues, and destroying all global trade, killing entire economies in the process. And yet big tech and governments would work in tangent to censor any criticism of these measures. I mean, many people in society still don't realize the true damage that lockdowns had on the population, but recently a report by The Telegraph, based on official figures from the Office for National Statistics, revealed that lockdown-related deaths surpassed those caused directly by COVID-19. The surge in undetected cancers, cardiac problems, and mental health conditions demonstrates the catastrophic consequences of prolonged isolation and disrupted healthcare services. The toll on the population is completely immeasurable. It has cost untold billions in damage, millions of people's lives, and an insane amount of excess death, averaging 1,000 per week just in the UK alone. So of course, once all of this truth unraveled over the government's disastrous actions, people then started to lose trust in the media outlets spouting this government messaging, causing nearly 50% of UK citizens alone to no longer even trust the BBC, a company that was one of the most trusted news organisations in history. And so as trust in traditional news outlets started to wane during the coronavirus, the government then sought to alternative means to disseminate its messages. Because if people weren't believing the news, they needed a new outlet, and so they integrated themselves with pop culture even more, also that the public would absorb government messaging and ignore logical thinking. And so the government used its nudge unit, otherwise known as the UK's Behavioural Control Unit, would admit to using unethical methods of quote mind control on the population, because this agency would secretly collaborate with production teams on popular TV shows like the famous Coronation Street in the UK, with the UK government going so far as to rewrite scripts in these shows to influence public opinion, and to make anyone criticising these government lockdown measures seem like just another crazy silly conspiracy theorist.
Dangerous how? Like the MMR vaccine causes autism. A lot of kids went unprotected, a lot of them got really ill. And Griff's secret cabal owning the media and banks is also a classic anti-Semitic trope.
And in fact, this was so important for the government to maintain control during COVID that these government-controlled TV shows were the only things permitted to continue as normal during the coronavirus lockdowns. We're talking about Coronation Street and EastEnders being one of the only things to maintain its freedom. Things that were actually good to keep the population healthy like gyms were all forced to close. And yet Coronation Street and EastEnders, these government-controlled programs, were permitted to continue as normal. And there's a reason why. The power of screens and TV programs in shaping beliefs cannot be underestimated. Because TV shows put you in highly suggestible states, which means that information from these shows can go straight into your subconscious, altering your beliefs and giving you new beliefs from the top, putting you into an alpha state, a state which is like daydreaming, a trance-like daydreaming state that turns off your neocortex when you watch these things, allowing information to go straight into your long-term memory. And this is how governments across the world convinced the entire global population to be content with the fact that they were stuck inside their house, their businesses destroyed, and their mental health being ruined. And today there has been absolutely no consequences for the people that have caused such historic damage on the world.
And so the loop goes on and on, facilitating the growth of all these other scams we mentioned in this list.